Hey photographers, this week's assignment is going to be based on observation because that's an important part of taking photographs. So you're going to be choosing an object that has a lot of tonal value. So I found this feather that has lots of lights and darks and some grays in between, and you're going to be observing it, and then you're going to be drawing it or painting it to the best of your ability. So I'm going to start out by trying to do some watercolor with this feather. And you can use whatever medium you want. You don't have to use watercolor. I have some pencils that I will show you a little bit of how you could use those as well, and a couple of different pens. So for now I'm just going to get a little bit of black watercolor and just kind of mix it in this palette. If you're using watercolor, you want to start with a lighter value as opposed to having a really dark one and then not being able to get it lighter. And I happen to have this little fan brush, but it doesn't really matter what kind of a brush you use. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of figure out where the lights and darks of this object are. So I'm actually going to go back to my smaller brush, and I'll just kind of do the outside and do this. Again, it is not so much about making it look beautiful, it's just about how to observe something and then hopefully make it look at least a little bit like the object that you're drawing. So you can see I'm hardly putting any watercolor down at first. And now I'm going to go back in with a fan brush and try and make a little bit darker values. And I'm going to restate that line that goes down the middle. And then I'll go in with that lighter, or that smaller brush again, maybe add a tiny bit of brown to it so that I can define some of those lines. With watercolor, if you've ever used watercolor before, you may know that watercolor is a pigment, and so it works in layers. So as you lay down more layers on top of layers in watercolor, it actually has an additive effect. And that means that even if you have a wet brush and you try and just use a wet brush to wetten an area, I don't even know if that's a word, then you end up darkening that area as well. Alright, it doesn't have to be super perfect or beautiful. And again, this is to the best of your ability. See, mine doesn't even look like this feather. It got way too fat, but that's totally okay. And then the last thing you want to do is make sure that you can see that broad range of tonal values. So I'm going to go back in with a little bit of black and a little bit of brown and just trying to find some of those really dark shapes. That goes here. In terms of finding objects, I just went for a walk with my dogs and I found this feather in the kind of open space by my house. So if you are looking for feathers, a good place to look for that would be if you live near any kind of a gulch where there are ponds or streams, because that's where the birds tend to go, and that's where you can find a bunch of feathers. Otherwise, in terms of objects, you can also find leaves, although the leaves might not have a lot of tonal value right now because they're all kind of brown, unless you can find some little leaf, like green leaf buds that are budding right now. You could try pine cones. Usually objects from nature work really well. Going to be your lesson. Instead of going into this with multiple different mediums, I'll just show you very quickly. So that would be an example of watercolor. If I want to use pencil, I would do pretty much the same thing. So just looking at this from observation. When you're drawing from observation, it really helps to try and keep as much of your eye on the object as opposed to on the paper when you're drawing it. And then when you're using pencil, it's really nice to use something to blend the pencil with, so you can just, if you want to put a little bit of shading on there with the side of the pencil, and then you can go in with something like a paper towel or a Kleenex, and you can blend it so that the shading is a little bit more smooth.